The main question that I address in my work on character could be described in a fairly general way. I'm interested in the ethical dimensions of ritualized activity. But rather than focus on ritualized activity as such or in the abstract, I focus on the liturgical practices within the Eastern Orthodox Church. And rather than talk about ethical dimensions in the abstract, I talk about the contribution that this sort of practice makes to the formation and sustenance of various sorts of character traits. And so it's the intersection of philosophy, liturgy, and ethics. That's sort of what I'm up to. Off the beaten path, definitely for a philosopher, and I would say even for most theologians too. The answers that I've arrived at this point and the way in which I've done so, well, let me address maybe the second part first. And the philosophers are typically interested in conceptual analysis, reading text carefully, working through arguments, that sort of thing. And bringing that toolkit and that approach to the liturgical texts and practices I found is actually quite challenging, because on the one hand you have these texts, right, and a lot of them are poetic in nature. There is a branch of philosophy of literature. It's sort of a relatively minor subfield within philosophy, and certainly philosophers don't do a whole lot on poetry. And then on the other hand, you have the performative aspects of the liturgy, which have to do with ritualized action. And within philosophy, you really don't have a lot of people talking about that sort of thing. So the first thing that struck me was, whoa, this is difficult, and it's not obvious how the philosopher's toolkit gets applied to this sort of thing. So that having been noted, what I tried to do is the following. I tried to isolate what I take to be the central ethical vision at the heart of ancient Christianity. And I take that ethical vision to be captured in large measure by Jesus' teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' teaching at the Sermon on the Mount. And this teaching, in large measure, is a rejection of what's sometimes called the reciprocity code, where we're to repay favors in kind and we're to repay evils in kind. And Jesus' pronouncement is something like, no, yeah, you can repay the favors. Ethically, it's not really important, but what's important for you to do is to love your enemies and to bless those who curse you. So there's that fairly radical new teaching going on here. In addition to this, there's an emphasis in Jesus' teaching, I think you see this in the parable of the Good Samaritan perhaps most vividly, of not operating with in-group and out-group distinctions, that the ethical life, well-attuned, is not sensitive to that sort of thing, in as much as we're to treat the needs and obligations of those who belong to putative out-groups as just as important as the needs and obligations that we see around us in the various groups that we belong and identify with. So if you could think of these two dimensions of Christian ethical teaching as being really focal, my question was, how does it get expressed or enacted in the liturgical life of Eastern Christianity? And what I found is that it's all over the place, and it's really interesting. So for example, if you pay attention to the petitions in the Eastern Orthodox liturgy, and these petitions will occur again and again. The Eastern liturgy tends not to be angular, tends to be cyclical. So if you didn't get it the first time, you do it another time. You didn't get it the second time, you do it another time, and so on. These petitions, which are directed at God, but pray for the poor, the oppressed, those working in the mines, captives, those who are traveling. In short, the sort of people that belong to various sorts of outgroups in various ways. So what we have here, I think, is not simply a training to sensitize ourselves to the needs and obligations, but actually an enactment within the liturgy of Jesus' teaching. In addition, there are really interesting passages which run to the fact that we pray for everyone. Political powers, even when they're oppressive, and in certain versions of the liturgy, there are prayers to the fact that we pray for all those who love us, all those who hate us, once again enacting Jesus' teaching that we're to pray for those who oppress, those who hate, those who curse, and bless in response. So one of the main findings that I found is the way in which the liturgy enacts what I'm calling the core ethical vision that you find in the New Testament. Well, the research that I plan to do in the future on character will continue to be connected with my interest in Eastern Christian liturgy. In a lot of ways, I feel like I've just scratched the surface here. There's just a lot more to do. Some of the topics in which I'm interested are the role of various kinds of ritualized action. So within the liturgy, there's a lot of tactile stuff going on. There's a lot of touching that goes on in the liturgy with regard to the art, the icons, with regard to food, the Eucharistic meal, with regard to each other, the kiss of peace. So I think it's very different from many other Christian services in this respect. And you're interacting with physical elements, bread, water, wine, oil, artworks, and so forth. It seems clear to me that this sort of tactile and multi-sensory interaction with physical elements is really important for forming our sensibilities, how we see the world, how we react to the world, and the material world, each other, God, so forth. And I feel like I haven't understood that yet. I need to understand this better, how it is that our sensibilities and ways of seeing the world get shaped by this sort of activity. A lot of it which happens on a level below belief. It's what philosophers would call subdoxastic. And that's something I'm very interested in. And I think I'm groping my way towards figuring out how to conceptualize and how to think about this element of liturgical activity. So why is it important to study character? I think Aristotle says at one point in the Nicomachean Ethics, he says it's really important to have a target, something at which we're aiming. And it seems to me absolutely central to the ethical life to identify the sorts of character traits that we want to acquire and that we want to sustain and that we want to inculcate in our children and other people that we live with and care for. So character seems to me right at the heart of the ethical life. And so as someone who works in moral philosophy, I take it to be clear that we need a better understanding of this. And it seems to me not only do we need a better understanding of what character is and its various dimensions, drawing upon psychology, drawing upon theology, sociology, these various other disciplines, but we also need to figure out how to cope with failures in this case, because a lot of times we just simply do not succeed in acquiring the character traits that we would want. So that, I think, is another important dimension that philosophers need to think about, and how it is that, as I say, we deal with falling short of our ideals. So yes, identify the ideals, figure out how we can try to embody these ideals, but also figure out how to live in the rough and tumble disappointments of the ethical life.